Her parents rejected her because of her skin color without even looking at her. 20 years later, she returned to their lives, and what she said shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Rain tapped gently against the high glass windows of the private New York clinic, drawing pale ribbons across the darkened sky. The soft, rhythmic sound merged with the low hum of machines and the distant beeping of monitors, creating a quiet tension that pulsed through the hallways. Nurses in crisp white moved quickly, glancing at their clipboards, whispering to one another as they passed the labor and delivery wing, where the scent of antiseptic clung to every surface, and the air itself seemed tight with expectation. Rebecca Whitmore lay on the delivery bed, her pale hair damp against her temples, her blue eyes wide, not with pain, but with the electric fear that settled deep into her bones as she gripped the sheets beneath her. She had spent months imagining this day, dreaming of the soft cries of her baby, of the delicate fingers curling around her own, of the warm glow that would fill the sterile room when she finally saw the child she had waited for. The child she had whispered to every morning, pressing her hand against the curve of her belly. She had bought dresses and blankets in shades of cream and rosé, had imagined the child's face, a mirror of her own, with soft, pale skin and downy blonde hair, blue eyes just like hers. Jason Whitmore stood by the window, his reflection fractured in the rain-specked glass, tall and composed in his tailored navy suit, the cuffs of his white shirt pressed to perfection, the knot of his silk tie centered precisely at the collar. His hands were clasped behind his back, the watch on his wrist gleaming under the ceiling lights as he glanced at it, calculating, as he always did, how long this would take. How long before they could return to the orderly pattern of their lives. His face was carved from marble, each line of his jaw and mouth set in the expressionless calm that had carried him through boardrooms and courtrooms, through negotiations worth millions, through family gatherings where he was expected to be the image of control. Rebecca's breath caught as the pain finally crested, her hands gripping tighter, a cry escaping her lips as the doctor urged her to push, to hold, to breathe. Her eyes searched for Jason, who did not move from his place by the window, did not offer a word of comfort, only turned slightly, enough to acknowledge that he was present, that he was here for the birth of his first child, the heir they had both expected, the symbol of their flawless union and impeccable lineage. The room was bright, harsh lights above reflecting off metal tools, glinting in the polished surfaces as the nurses leaned in, voices calm, professional, guiding Rebecca through each breath, each push, each moment that drew them closer to the arrival of the child who would carry their name. The scent of antiseptic and sweat, the heavy scent of blood, and the sterile sting of alcohol pads filled the air, mixing with the soft cries of the newborn as the baby finally emerged, wet and trembling, her tiny hands unfurling like petals, reaching out into the cold world that had been waiting for her. The nurse cleaned the infant gently, wrapping her in a soft white blanket, her cries quieting into small, confused sounds, the dark curls on her head wet against her delicate skin, her tiny chest rising and falling with fragile breaths. The nurse turned, stepping toward Rebecca with the bundle held carefully, the baby's small hands peeking from the folds, her eyes blinking open, dark and deep, seeking the light. Rebecca reached out instinctively, her fingers trembling, her heart thundering in her chest. But the moment her eyes settled on the child's face, something in her cracked, a sharp fissure that ran through the carefully constructed walls of her mind. The baby's skin was warm, soft, but not pale like the blankets that surrounded her, not pink like the roses Rebecca had chosen for her nursery, not the perfect mirror of her own reflection. Instead, the child's skin was a soft, unmistakable shade of brown, her dark hair curling against her forehead, her eyes like deep pools of night, reflecting the overhead lights in glimmers that were nothing like the blue Rebecca had imagined, nothing like the visions she had clung to. Rebecca's hands froze, her fingers pulling back as if burned, her eyes widening with horror, with confusion, with a rage that bubbled up so quickly she could taste it on her tongue. She turned her gaze to Jason, who had finally turned fully, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the child, the silence in the room thickening as even the nurses paused, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden sharp edge that made it hard to breathe. "This isn't right," Rebecca whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes still locked on the child who looked up at her, unaware, innocent, her small mouth forming soft, questioning sounds. The nurse shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the mother and the child, uncertain, holding the baby closer as if to shield her from the cold that had settled into the room. Jason stepped forward, his shoes silent on the tile floor, each movement precise, deliberate. His eyes moved over the baby, his jaw tightening, a muscle in his cheek twitching as he turned his gaze to Rebecca, the accusation clear before he spoke, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them, the assumptions, the doubts, the fear of scandal that pulsed stronger than any paternal instinct. Rebecca shook her head, tears brimming, not from love or awe, but from fury, from betrayal, from the shattering of the image she had clung to. She pushed herself back against the pillows, her arms folding around herself as she turned her face away, unable to look at the child, unable to accept the reality that had intruded upon her carefully curated life. "Take her away," she said, her voice low, trembling, yet sharp enough to slice through the silence to make the nurse flinch. "This is a mistake. This child is not mine." The nurse opened her mouth, words caught in her throat, glancing at the doctor who stood frozen, his hands still gloved, the mask hanging from one ear, disbelief and discomfort etched across his features. Jason stepped forward, his hand rising in a small gesture, dismissive, commanding, his eyes cold as they settled on the nurse. "Do what needs to be done," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable, the threat that lived in every syllable, the weight of his name and wealth ensuring compliance. The nurse hesitated, looking down at the baby who had begun to fuss, her small hands waving, her dark eyes blinking up at the fluorescent lights, unaware of the sentence being passed upon her, unaware of the rejection that had already sealed her fate. The doctor nodded once, curtly, and the nurse turned, clutching the baby closer, stepping toward the door as the child's soft cries grew louder, echoing down the hallway as the door swung shut, the sound fading into the sterile, cold quiet of the room. Jason turned back to the window, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, his reflection now joined by the ghostly image of Rebecca in the glass, her face pale, her eyes red, but no longer filled with tears, only with a cold emptiness that spread through the room like a stain. They said nothing, the silence stretching, unbroken, as the rain continued to fall, washing the windows clean, carrying away the whispers of the child who was no longer theirs. In the hallway, the nurse moved quickly, clutching the baby as the child's cries softened into small, confused whimpers, her tiny face pressing against the fabric of the blanket, seeking warmth, seeking comfort that would not come from the parents who had turned away. The nurse's steps echoed in the empty hallway, the fluorescent lights above flickering as she reached the staff door, where a young orderly waited, his eyes downcast, his hands shoved into the pockets of his scrubs, shifting uncomfortably as she handed him the small, warm bundle. His name was Peter, and he had grown up in the shadows of men like Jason Whitmore, knowing the weight of money and power, knowing what was expected when instructions came from men like him. His hands closed around the child, who quieted as he held her, her tiny body fitting perfectly in his arms, her soft breath warm against his wrist. For a moment, he hesitated, looking down at the child's dark eyes, the small fingers curling weakly, the innocence so pure, so unknowing, it made something twist painfully in his chest. But orders were orders. He turned, pushing through the heavy door into the rain-soaked night, the scent of the city hitting him in a wave of wet asphalt and exhaust, the cold wind cutting through the thin fabric of his scrubs. He walked quickly, the bundle held close, moving down the side street to the small, battered car waiting by the curb. He opened the back door, placing the child gently on the seat, wrapping the blanket tighter around her as she whimpered softly, her eyes blinking up at him with a trust that tore at something inside him. Peter closed the door, sliding into the driver's seat, starting the engine as the windshield wipers smeared the rain across the glass, the rhythmic thud keeping time with the beating of his heart. He drove through the dark streets, past the glowing neon signs of late-night diners, the flickering street lights casting shadows that danced across the dashboard, each mile taking him farther from the sterile brightness of the clinic, farther from the parents who had chosen to erase their child. The outskirts of the city gave way to narrow roads lined with broken fences and darkened windows, the rain turning the dirt paths into slick mud as he pulled up near the small, weathered church that stood alone at the edge of the neighborhood, its steeple barely visible against the dark sky. He turned off the engine, the sudden silence heavy, the only sound the rain drumming against the roof of the car. Peter turned in his seat, looking at the child who had fallen silent, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily, her small hand clutching at the edge of the blanket. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different ending, a different choice, but the fear of what would happen if he did not complete his task was stronger, the memory of Jason Whitmore's cold eyes and quiet threats pressing down on him. He stepped out into the rain, the cold soaking through his scrubs as he opened the back door, lifting the child carefully, cradling her against his chest as he walked toward the church steps. The old wood creaked under his weight as he knelt, placing the bundle on the top step, adjusting the blanket around the child as she stirred, her dark eyes blinking open, meeting his for the briefest moment. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain, before he stood, stepping back, turning quickly as he walked away, his footsteps splashing through puddles, the darkness swallowing him as he disappeared down the road. The child lay on the steps, the rain falling around her, the blanket dampening slowly as the wind swept through the empty street, carrying the soft sounds of the city that paid her no mind. Her small hands moved weakly, her breath fogged in the cold air, her eyes closing as the world around her faded into the darkness, unaware of the storm that had brought her here, unaware of the path that lay before her, a path that would begin again in the arms of a stranger who would find her in the quiet moments before dawn. The rain softened into a mist by dawn, weaving a pale veil around the small church that stood at the edge of the neglected neighborhood. The wooden steps were slick and dark, the paint long peeled away by seasons of storms and forgotten prayers. The small bundle lay there, wrapped in a damp blanket, her breath clouding the cold air as the world around her slowly brightened with the gray promise of morning. The infant did not cry. Her small dark eyes blinked against the gray sky as if trying to understand the vast emptiness that surrounded her, the cold seeping into her tiny bones as she shifted weakly against the hard wood beneath her. Martha Harris was returning from the market that morning, a heavy basket over her arm filled with day-old bread and a few bruised apples, small packets of dried herbs tied with string, and the last of her coins spent on the cheapest tea she could find. Her joints ached from the cold, each step carefully measured as she walked along the cracked pavement, passing homes with shuttered windows and the silent gazes of stray cats that watched her from porches. She was used to the weight of loneliness, to the way people turned their eyes away when she passed, an old black woman with tired eyes and a soft voice that few cared to hear. She had worked late into the previous night, scrubbing floors in a small law office downtown, the fluorescent lights flickering above her as she moved the mop back and forth, her mind drifting to the years that had passed her by, the family she once had, the child she once held, the laughter that had long since faded into the dust that clung to the corners of the empty room she cleaned. She told herself each morning that it was enough to wake up and keep going, that it was enough to fill the kettle and listen to it whistle, to watch the dawn break over the broken fences outside her window. As she approached the steps of the church, she paused, a sound pulling her from her thoughts, a small, almost imperceptible noise that would have been missed if not for the silence that lay heavy in the early morning air. Martha's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, her breath catching as she saw the small bundle, the way the blanket was soaked through, the tiny fist that moved weakly, the soft, dark eyes that blinked up at her without fear, without expectation, without knowing that she had been abandoned to the cold world. For a long moment, Martha stood there, her basket hanging from her arm, the cold seeping into her skin, the rain settling into her hair. She felt the weight of the world shift in that moment, a quiet promise in the stillness as the infant blinked, a small sigh escaping her lips. Martha set down her basket, her hands trembling as she knelt, lifting the child carefully, cradling her against her chest, the warmth of the small body pressing against her heart, the softness of the blanket against her weathered hands. "It's all right," Martha whispered, though the child could not understand her words, though the world had already decided that she did not belong to anyone. It did not matter. The child's small hand curled into Martha's sweater, holding on with a quiet strength that brought tears to Martha's eyes. Tears she had not shed in many years. Tears that washed the cold from her face as she held the child close. She gathered her basket and stood, the child held securely in one arm as she turned away from the church, her steps steady as she made her way down the cracked sidewalk, past the houses that watched silently, past the empty street where the rain had washed the dust into the gutters, past the moments of hesitation that tried to claw at her heart. She did not stop to think of the consequences, of the questions that might come, of the eyes that would follow her, judging and whispering, wondering why she, an old woman with so little, would take on the burden of a child that was not her own. Martha returned to her small home, a two-room structure with peeling paint and a garden that struggled to survive the harsh seasons, a place filled with the scent of lavender and mint from the herbs she dried and hung along the kitchen walls. The child whimpered softly as Martha laid her gently on the old sofa, the springs creaking beneath the small weight as Martha hurried to light the stove, to warm water, to find the old baby bottles she had kept hidden in a box at the back of the cupboard, a memory of a life that had once been, a life that had left her alone with nothing but the echo of lullabies she had once sung. She cleaned the child carefully, replacing the soaked blanket with a soft cloth she had used as a towel, wrapping the infant tightly, holding her close as she fed her with trembling hands, watching the way the child's dark eyes closed slowly, the way her small body relaxed against Martha's chest, the way her breathing slowed into the gentle rhythm of sleep. In that moment, Martha felt a warmth spread through her, a purpose she had not felt in so many years, a quiet promise that she would not let this child slip away into the darkness that had taken so much from her already. The neighbors noticed, of course. They always noticed, though they said nothing to her face. They watched from behind curtains as Martha stepped out onto her porch with the baby in her arms, humming softly as she rocked the child, as she tended to the small garden, as she walked to the market with the child bundled against her chest, her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers that followed her. They called the child the abandoned one, the stranger, and worse, the words floating on the wind like poison, seeping into the cracks of the neighborhood, reminding Martha that the world was not kind, that it would always find a way to judge, to condemn, to wound. But in the small house, the world was different. Martha named the child Naomi, a name that meant pleasantness, a name that carried the strength of women who had survived, who had carried on, who had found a way to live when the world had tried to silence them. Naomi grew in that small home, her laughter filling the empty rooms, her small feet pattering across the wooden floors, her dark curls bouncing as she learned to walk, to run, to fall and get up again, her small hands reaching for Martha, who always caught her, who always held her, who always whispered that she was loved. Martha taught Naomi to read, using the old books she kept on a shelf above the fireplace, books with torn covers and yellowed pages, stories of worlds far beyond the cracked windows, stories of courage and hope, stories that Naomi devoured with wide eyes and a hunger that Martha recognized, a hunger for more, for something beyond the small, enclosed life that the world tried to give her. They read together by the light of a single lamp, Naomi's head resting against Martha's arm as she traced the words with her small finger, learning, absorbing, dreaming. The world outside did not stop being cruel. Children in the neighborhood avoided Naomi, their parents pulling them away with sharp looks, with whispered warnings that Naomi was different, that she did not belong, that she was a child of shame, of secrets, of sin. Naomi heard the words, felt the sting of their glances, the way doors closed when she approached, the way laughter turned sharp when she passed. She learned to hold her head high, to walk with a quiet dignity, to return home to Martha, who would open the door with a soft smile, with the scent of tea and herbs welcoming her back into the warmth. As Naomi grew, so did Martha's frailty. The coughs that came in the night grew harsher. The hand that once held Naomi so firmly now trembled. The steps that were once steady became slow, cautious, measured. Naomi noticed the way Martha's face tightened in pain, the way she tried to hide the blood on the handkerchief, the way she insisted that she was fine, that it was just a cold, that she would be all right. Naomi did not believe her, but she did not argue, instead finding ways to help, to carry the basket to the market, to sweep the floors, to fetch the water, to sit by Martha's side and hold her hand when the nights grew long and the world seemed too heavy to bear. They had little, but they had enough. Enough warmth, enough love, enough hope to keep going, to find joy in the small moments, in the shared smiles, in the soft words spoken in the quiet of the evening as they sat together, the lamp casting a warm glow around them. Naomi learned to cook, to mend, to care for Martha, as Martha had cared for her, the roles shifting slowly, gently, until it was Naomi who stood by the stove, Naomi who brushed Martha's hair, Naomi who whispered lullabies when the pain became too much. The whispers in the neighborhood never stopped, but Naomi learned to ignore them, to focus on the sound of Martha's breathing, on the rhythm of the pages turning, on the small victories of each day, each moment they shared together in the small house that had become their world. Naomi's eyes grew bright with determination, her hands steady as she worked, her mind sharp as she learned, as she studied the books Martha found for her, as she dreamed of a future that would not be defined by the past that had tried to erase her. In that small, warm, fragile world, Naomi found the strength to believe in herself, to believe that she was more than the whispers, more than the judgments, more than the abandonment that had begun her life. She was Naomi, and she was loved, and as Martha's coughs grew harsher, as the nights grew colder, Naomi held on to that love, that strength, that quiet promise that she would not let the world break her, that she would carry forward the light that Martha had given her, even when the darkness tried to consume everything they had built together. The air in the small house had grown heavy, the scent of dried herbs and old wood mixing with the sharp, bitter tang of sickness that clung to the corners of the rooms. The coughs came in the middle of the night, harsh and wet, tearing through the silence as Naomi lay in her small bed, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders, staring at the ceiling as she listened to Martha's struggle to catch her breath in the darkness. Sometimes Naomi would slip from her bed and tiptoe across the creaking floorboards, pushing open the door to find Martha sitting on the edge of her bed, her shoulders hunched, the blood-stained handkerchief pressed to her lips, her eyes closing in pain before she forced a smile, whispering that she was fine, that it would pass, that there was nothing to worry about. Naomi knew better. She saw the way Martha's steps slowed each day, the way her hands trembled as she stirred the thin soup on the stove, the way her breaths came shallow, the way she paused to steady herself on the doorframe as she moved from one room to the next. Naomi began to take on more, rising before dawn to fetch water from the pump down the street, her small hands gripping the heavy pail as she carried it back to the house, her arms aching with the effort. She swept the floors, dusted the shelves, tended the small garden that struggled to grow in the cracked earth behind the house, pulling weeds and turning the soil with careful hands, hoping that the herbs and vegetables would continue to grow despite the dryness of the season. School was a place of shadows and whispers, a place where Naomi felt the weight of eyes on her back as she walked the narrow halls, the whispers that followed her like a cold breeze. The children at school never invited her to play, never shared their lunches with her, never sat beside her unless there was no other choice. Their parents had warned them, she knew, had told them stories about the girl who was not like them, the girl who had been abandoned, the girl who had no father, no mother, no name worth speaking. They called her names, muttering under their breath as she passed, words like stray, like filth, like curse. Sometimes they would knock her books from her hands, sending the pages scattering across the dirt, laughter ringing out as she knelt to gather them, keeping her head down, her fingers brushing the dust from the pages as she tucked them back into her bag. But Naomi refused to let them see her cry. Each day she held her head high as she walked home, her steps steady even as her heart ached with the loneliness that settled deep inside her. She would push open the door to the small house and find Martha waiting, her face lighting up with a tired smile, her arms opening to welcome Naomi into a gentle embrace that smelled of mint and lavender, of warmth and safety. In those moments, the world outside seemed to fade. the whispers and the laughter and the cruel words disappearing as Naomi pressed her face against Martha's shoulder, feeling the steady, comforting beat of her heart. The evenings were the best part of the day when the sun dipped below the rooftops and the golden light filled the small house, casting long shadows on the wooden floors. Naomi would sit beside Martha with one of the old books open across their laps, her finger tracing the words as she read aloud, her voice soft but steady, the stories carrying them both away from the harshness of the world outside. Martha would nod, her eyes closing as she listened, her hand resting on Naomi's back, the slow rise and fall of her chest a reminder that she was still there, still fighting, still holding on. Naomi loved those moments, the quiet peace that settled over them as the words filled the room, stories of distant lands and brave souls, of healers and warriors, of people who rose above the darkness to find light, even when it seemed impossible. She dreamed of becoming one of those people, of finding a way to rise above the whispers, above the cruelty, above the heavy weight of being unwanted, unloved by the world outside their small home. As Martha's illness worsened, Naomi found herself seeking small jobs around the neighborhood, knocking on doors to offer help with gardens, with cleaning, with carrying heavy baskets from the market. The doors often closed quickly, the faces that met her at the threshold cold, eyes narrowing as they took in her dark skin, her patched clothes, the look of determination in her eyes that seemed to unsettle them. Sometimes they would hand her small tasks, paying her a few coins to weed a garden or scrub a step, but more often they sent her away with a shake of their heads, the doors closing with a finality that left Naomi standing alone on the steps, clutching her empty hands to her chest. She tried to hide the disappointment from Martha, returning home with a forced smile, helping her to the table for dinner, the thin broth steaming in chipped bowls, the small pieces of bread they shared carefully divided to last through the week. Martha would thank her, would stroke her hair with trembling hands, telling her how proud she was, how strong she was, how she would one day find a way out of the small life that had been forced upon her. But the days grew shorter, the nights colder, the small home filled with the sound of Martha's coughing, the wet, rattling sound that made Naomi press her hands over her ears as she lay in bed, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she tried to imagine a world where she was not alone, where Martha would rise in the morning with strength in her steps, with laughter in her voice, with the warmth of health that would keep the darkness at bay. One evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops and the shadows crept into the corners of the room, Naomi returned from the market, her small basket nearly empty, the coins she had managed to earn slipping through the cracks of her needs. She found Martha sitting by the window, her hands clutching the arms of the chair, her breath coming in short, painful gasps, her eyes distant as she stared out at the small garden that had begun to wither in the cold. Naomi dropped the basket and rushed to her side, kneeling beside the chair, taking Martha's hands in her own, feeling the coldness in her skin, the weakness in her grip. Martha turned her eyes to Naomi, a faint smile breaking across her lips as she lifted a hand to brush a tear from Naomi's cheek, her fingers barely touching the skin before falling back into her lap. "Don't cry, Naomi," Martha whispered, her voice so soft that Naomi had to lean in to hear, her tears falling freely now, dripping onto Martha's trembling hands. "You are stronger than this world. You are brighter than its darkness." Naomi shook her head, clutching Martha's hands, pressing them to her lips as she sobbed, the fear that had lived in her chest for so long breaking free, the knowledge that she was about to lose the only person who had ever loved her, the only person who had ever seen her as more than a burden, more than a mistake, more than the whispers and the judgments that had followed her since the day she was born. That night, Martha's breathing grew softer, her chest rising and falling in shallow waves as Naomi sat by her side, holding her hand, reading from the old book with a voice that trembled, the words breaking as tears filled her throat as the candle flickered and the shadows danced on the walls around them. Martha's eyes closed, a soft smile on her lips as she listened, her hand squeezing Naomi's once, weakly, before falling still. Naomi did not remember falling asleep, her head resting against the edge of the bed, the book open on the floor beside her, the candle burned down to nothing. She woke to the silence of dawn, the world holding its breath as the first light crept across the floor, touching Martha's still face, the softness of her features frozen in peace, the sickness gone, leaving behind only the quiet emptiness that filled the small house. She buried Martha herself, digging the earth in the small garden with trembling hands, tears falling into the soil as she worked, the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, whispering but offering no help, no words of comfort, no prayers. She wrapped Martha in the old quilt that had warmed them both on cold nights, lowering her into the earth with hands that shook, pressing the soil down gently, whispering promises through her tears, promises that she would not let the world break her, that she would find a way to honor the love that had saved her. When it was done, Naomi stood alone in the small garden, the morning sun rising behind her, the cold wind brushing against her face as she turned to the house, the silence pressing in around her as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the weight of the world settling on her shoulders as she took her first steps into the cruel world without the only family she had ever known. The days after Martha's burial fell over Naomi like a gray, endless fog, stretching across the small rooms of the house until every corner felt heavy, each breath she took echoing in the silence. She woke each morning to the thin, cold light pushing through the curtains, the emptiness beside her in the bed reminding her of the warmth that was gone, of the gentle voice that would not greet her with a soft hum or a whispered prayer for strength. She would lie there, the thin blanket pulled around her shoulders, staring at the ceiling while the light shifted from dawn to day, listening to the wind against the window pane, to the distant sounds of carts and footsteps and laughter that did not belong to her world. Naomi kept the house clean, washing the floors until her knees were sore, wiping the dust from the shelves where Martha's herbs still hung, their scent growing fainter with each day. She cooked small meals, boiling thin soups, cutting the last of the bread into small pieces to stretch them across the week, forcing herself to eat, though the taste of each bite was empty, her hunger dulled by the heaviness in her chest. At night, she would sit by the window, the old book in her hands, reading aloud to the empty room, the words trembling as they fell into the silence, her voice cracking as she forced herself to continue, remembering how Martha would smile, how she would close her eyes and listen, how she would say, softly, that Naomi's voice was a light in the darkness. But the darkness pressed closer now, the world outside her small home turning colder as the days shortened, the wind sharper, the nights longer. She wrapped herself in Martha's old shawl, sitting near the stove where the fire burned low, the warmth barely enough to chase the chill from the air. She listened to the sounds of the neighborhood, to the laughter of children she once watched from a distance, to the heavy footsteps of men returning from work, to the quiet murmurs of mothers calling their children inside as the night settled in. Naomi tried to find work, stepping out each morning with the small bag Martha had given her, walking the narrow streets lined with cracked fences and shuttered windows, knocking on doors with trembling hands, offering to clean, to sweep, to carry water, to help in any way she could. Some doors opened just enough for her to see the wary eyes of the people inside, eyes that looked her up and down, seeing her patched clothes, her dark skin, the determined look in her eyes that she could not hide. Some would nod, allowing her to scrub steps or sweep porches, handing her a few coins without meeting her gaze before closing the door quickly, as if her presence was something to be ashamed of. Others would shake their heads, turning away, closing the door in her face without a word, leaving her standing on the cold steps, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag as she blinked away the tears that threatened to fall. She would return home each evening, her shoes wet from the muddy streets, her fingers numb, her stomach empty. She would light the small lamp, sitting at the table where Martha once sat, counting the few coins she had earned, planning how to make them last, how to buy bread and wood for the stove, how to keep the small home warm for another day, another night. She would fall asleep with her head on the table, the lamp burning low, dreams filled with Martha's voice calling her name, dreams of warmth and safety, dreams that slipped away each morning as she woke to the cold dawn. The whispers began to grow in the neighborhood, the women who gathered at the market glancing at her with narrowed eyes, their voices low as they spoke of the girl who had been left behind, who had no family, no father, no mother, who should not be living alone in a house that did not belong to her. Children were told not to play near her home, not to speak to her if they saw her on the street, to cross to the other side when she approached, to avoid her dark eyes that seemed to see too much, to avoid the curse they said followed her wherever she went. Naomi heard the whispers, felt the eyes on her back as she walked, the fear and suspicion that hung in the air as heavy as the clouds above. She kept her head high, walking with careful steps, her shoulders straight, refusing to let them see the way their words cut into her, refusing to let them see the way her hands shook as she reached for the door of her home each night, the way her breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside, closing the door against the world that seemed to press closer with each day. The winter came early that year, the frost biting into the earth, the wind howling through the streets, rattling the windows of the small house as Naomi lay awake, pulling the blankets tighter around her, trying to stay warm as the cold crept into the room, into her bones. The woodpile grew smaller with each day, the coins she earned not enough to buy more, the meals growing thinner, the hunger sharper, the silence deeper. One morning, as the frost still clung to the edges of the windows, there was a knock at the door. Naomi paused, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea, her eyes narrowing as she rose, crossing the room to open the door. A group stood there, the neighbors who had once watched her from a distance, their faces tight, their eyes hard, the cold air swirling around them as they stepped closer, forcing Naomi back into the room. They told her she could not stay, that the house did not belong to her, that a girl like her should not be living alone, that she was a burden, a problem, a reminder of things they did not want to see. They spoke of order, of decency, of the way things were meant to be, their voices rising with each word, the accusations falling on her like blows, each one cutting deeper, each one tearing away the fragile hope she had tried to hold on to. Naomi tried to speak, her voice shaking as she told them she would pay, that she would work, that she would find a way to stay, but they would not listen. Their eyes filled with the fear and hatred that had followed her since the day she was born, since the day she was left on the steps of the church, since the day the world decided she was not wanted. They told her she had until sunset to leave, to take what little she had and go, to disappear, to vanish from their sight, from their streets, from their lives. They turned and left, the door closing behind them with a final, echoing thud that left the small house shaking, the silence that followed deeper than before, heavier, colder. Naomi stood in the middle of the room, the cup of tea cooling on the table, the light from the window casting long shadows across the floor as she looked around at the home that had been her world, the walls that had held the laughter and warmth of the only family she had known, the small touches of Martha still lingering in every corner, in the worn blanket on the bed, in the books on the shelf, in the herbs that hung drying above the stove. She packed what she could into the small bag, folding Martha's shawl carefully, tucking the old book inside, wrapping the last pieces of bread in a cloth, her hands moving slowly, methodically, as she prepared to leave the only place that had ever been home. She paused at the door, turning to look back one last time, her eyes tracing the lines of the room, the memories that clung to the air, the promise she had made to Martha that she would not let the world break her. As the sun began to set, Naomi stepped out into the cold, the wind biting at her skin as she pulled the shawl around her shoulders, the small bag over her arm, the weight of it light, the weight of her heart heavy. She walked down the narrow street, past the houses where curtains twitched as she passed, past the fences that seemed taller now, past the shadows that grew longer as the light faded. She did not look back as she reached the edge of the village, the fields stretching out before her, the trees dark against the twilight sky, the road winding into the distance. She walked with steady steps, each one taking her farther from the home she had known, from the warmth she had lost, from the whispers that had tried to define her. As night fell, Naomi found herself in the forest, where the road grew narrow, the branches of the trees reaching overhead, the stars beginning to prick the sky with cold light. She stopped, sinking to her knees on the cold earth, the tears finally falling as she clutched the shawl around her, the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her until she could not breathe, until the darkness swallowed her sobs. She did not hear the sound of the carriage wheels on the road, did not see the light of the lantern as it approached, did not know that her journey was about to change as a figure stepped down from the carriage, a man with kind eyes and a steady voice, a doctor who saw the girl kneeling in the darkness and knew without words that he could not leave her there. Naomi looked up, her tears streaking her cheeks, the cold air burning in her lungs as she met his gaze, the world holding its breath for a moment as the lantern light shone between them, as the darkness around them seemed to pause, waiting as the road ahead began to open, carrying Naomi forward into a future she could not yet see, a future she would claim with the strength she had built from every moment she had survived. The lantern light flickered softly as the carriage rolled slowly through the narrow forest path, the cold night air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, Naomi sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the shawl pulled close around her thin shoulders as the man who had found her drove them through the darkness. His name was Dr. Harry Allen, a man whose lined face and steady blue eyes spoke of years spent tending to others, of nights spent beside the sick and the dying, of choices made quietly in the still hours before dawn. He did not ask many questions, only glanced at Naomi with a soft concern that made her look away, her eyes fixed on the shifting shadows that passed beyond the window, each tree a dark sentinel watching her as she left behind the village that had cast her out. She did not know where they were going, only that she was leaving the forest where she had fallen to her knees, where the cold had wrapped around her like a shroud, where she had whispered to Martha in the dark, promising she would not give up, even when the world seemed determined to break her. Now the wheels turned beneath her, carrying her toward a place she had never seen, toward a city whose lights rose on the horizon like distant stars, twinkling through the darkness as the carriage crested a hill, revealing the sprawl of Aurelia below. A city that hummed even in the late hours, alive with the breath of countless souls moving beneath the glow of lanterns and the sharp glint of electric lights. As they entered the city, Naomi pressed her face to the cold glass of the window, her breath fogging the surface as she watched the streets unfold before her. Brick buildings lined the roads, narrow alleys splitting between them like the lines of a map she could not yet read. Signs swung softly in the breeze, advertising bakeries and cloth shops, small restaurants whose doors glowed warmly against the night. She saw people huddled beneath blankets on the sidewalks, their eyes following the carriage as it passed, saw children darting through the shadows, their laughter sharp and quick, saw women closing the shutters of their windows, pulling the night around them like a cloak. Dr. Allen brought her to a modest building near the edge of the city, a place that smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, the steps worn from years of use, the brass handle of the door polished by countless hands. He led her inside, the warmth of the small foyer wrapping around her as the scent of soap and old wood settled into her senses. A comforting, clean scent that reminded her of Martha's careful hands scrubbing the floors of their small home. There was a room for her on the second floor, a narrow bed with a quilt tucked neatly over it, a small window that looked out onto the street below where the glow of the street lamps cast long shadows across the cobblestones. Naomi stood by the window that first night, her hands pressed against the glass as she watched the city, her reflection a pale shadow among the lights, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of the world she had entered, a world that felt too large, too fast, too loud for the quiet girl she had been, for the abandoned child she had once been. In the mornings, Naomi rose before dawn, pulling the quilt around her shoulders as she dressed in the clothes Dr. Allen had found for her, plain skirts and simple blouses, sturdy shoes that pinched her feet but protected them from the cold stones of the street. She washed her face in the small basin, the water cold enough to steal her breath, combed her hair back tightly, tying it with a piece of ribbon before stepping down to the kitchen where the other women who worked in the building were already gathered, preparing for the day ahead. Dr. Allen had found her work as a cleaner in the small hospital near the edge of the district, a place where the halls smelled of carbolic soap and sickness, where the floors were scrubbed daily but still held the scent of blood and sweat, of the quiet despair that lived in the corners where the light did not always reach. Naomi was given a bucket and a rag, a broom and a mop, and she worked in silence, her hands raw from the soap, her back aching from the long hours spent bent over the floors, scrubbing away the stains that seemed to seep into her skin. She learned to move quickly, to step aside as the nurses rushed past, their arms full of linens and bandages, to flatten herself against the wall as the doctors moved through the halls with quick, decisive steps, their voices sharp as they barked orders, as they called for instruments, for water, for more light. She learned the rhythm of the hospital, the way the days bled into nights, the way the cries of the sick and the dying echoed down the halls, the way the silence that followed was often heavier than the sounds that had come before. At night, Naomi returned to her small room, her hands red and cracked, the ache in her legs a constant reminder of the work she had done, of the work that would wait for her again in the morning. She washed in the cold water, scrubbing away the scent of the hospital, the faint stain of blood that sometimes clung to the hem of her skirts, the sharp tang of disinfectant that lingered beneath her nails. She would sit by the window, the small book Martha had given her open in her lap, her eyes scanning the words by the light of the street lamps below, her lips moving silently as she read, the words weaving themselves into her mind, a quiet promise that she would not stop learning, that she would not stop dreaming. When she had saved enough from her wages, she enrolled in the night classes offered at the small school near the hospital, classes for those who worked during the day, who could only study when the city was quiet, when the streets were empty, when the world seemed to pause just long enough for dreams to take root. Naomi sat in the back of the small classroom, the light of the oil lamps casting shadows across the worn desks, her pencil moving quickly as she took notes, her eyes bright with determination as she learned the words of anatomy, of physiology, of the medicines that the doctors in the hospital spoke of in hurried whispers. The other students often glanced at her, at the way she sat straight in her seat, her eyes never leaving the blackboard, her hands steady as she copied the notes, as she memorized the words that would carry her closer to the future she could barely allow herself to imagine. Some whispered about her, about the girl with the dark eyes and the quiet voice, about the way she never missed a class, about the way she worked in the hospital all day and still came to class each night, her uniform smelling of soap and medicine, her hair tied back in a neat braid that fell down her back. Naomi ignored the whispers, focusing instead on the words, on the diagrams, on the books she borrowed from the small library, reading them late into the night by the light of the single candle she allowed herself, the wax dripping onto the pages as she turned them carefully, absorbing the knowledge, holding it close, using it to build the future she had promised herself, the future she had promised Martha. The winter was harsh, the wind cutting through the streets like a blade, the snow piling against the doors, the cold creeping through the cracks in the windows, no matter how many blankets Naomi pulled around her. She fell ill once, her body shaking with fever, her head heavy as she tried to rise from her bed, collapsing back onto the thin mattress as the room spun around her, the ceiling shifting in and out of focus. Dr. Allen found her there, his hands cool against her burning skin, his voice a steady anchor in the fog of her sickness as he brought water to her lips, as he whispered that she would be all right, that she was strong, that she would survive. And she did. Naomi rose from her sickness with a new fire in her, a deeper resolve that pushed her forward even when the days were long and the nights cold, even when the work was hard and the studies endless, even when the world seemed to press against her, reminding her of who she was, of where she had come from, of what the world believed she could never be. She pushed back with every breath, with every step, with every word she learned, every page she read, every floor she scrubbed until it shone. 3 years passed in this way, each day a battle, each night a quiet victory as she learned, as she saved, as she grew stronger. Naomi became known in the hospital for her steady hands, for her quick mind, for the way she watched the doctors and nurses, learning from their movements, memorizing the way they wrapped bandages, the way they mixed medicines, the way they calmed the frightened eyes of the patients who came through the doors. When emergencies came in the middle of the night, when blood stained the floors she was cleaning, when screams echoed through the halls, Naomi did not run, did not look away. She stayed, watching, learning, helping when she could, her hands moving with a quiet confidence that surprised even the nurses who had once ignored her. And when the time came, when she had saved enough, when her studies had carried her as far as they could within the small school, Naomi applied to the medical college in Aurelia, her hands trembling as she filled out the forms, as she handed them to the clerk who looked at her with raised eyebrows, glancing at her dark skin, at her worn clothes, at the determined set of her jaw. She stood there, her back straight, her eyes unwavering, as the papers were accepted, as her name was written in the ledger, as she stepped into the next part of her journey. When the letter arrived, crisp and white, bearing the seal of the college, Naomi opened it with careful hands, her breath held as she read the words that told her she had been accepted, that she would begin in the fall, that she would wear the coat of a student doctor, that she would learn not only how to clean the floors of the hospital, but how to heal the people who lay upon the beds, how to hold their lives in her hands, how to become what she had dreamed of becoming in the quiet nights as she read to Martha in the glow of the lamplight. That night, Naomi sat by the window, the letter in her lap, the city below her alive with lights, with voices, with the soft hum of life moving through the streets. She closed her eyes, the memory of Martha's voice in her ears, the warmth of her embrace around her shoulders, the promise she had made to her in the quiet moments before dawn, the promise that she would not let the world break her, that she would find a way to rise, to become the light in the darkness. And in that moment, as the cold wind brushed against the window pane, as the stars shifted in the dark sky above, Naomi allowed herself to believe that she was on her way, that she was becoming the person she was meant to be, that she was claiming her place in a world that had tried to erase her, one step, one breath, one battle at a time. The morning Naomi first walked into Aurelia Medical College dawned gray and soft, a fine drizzle misting the streets as she stepped from the tram, her books held tightly to her chest, the dark blue coat she had saved months to buy buttoned high against the cold. The city was waking around her, carriages rattling over the cobblestones, vendors calling out the price of bread and onions, children in woolen hats darting between puddles as their mothers pulled them along. She lifted her head, breathing in the scent of rain and coal smoke, feeling the weight of the college gates rising before her, black iron against the pale sky, a promise she had carved out of long nights and aching hands. Inside, the hallways echoed with the low hum of students' voices, footsteps clicking on stone floors, the rustle of papers and the creak of wooden benches as young men and women found their places, opening notebooks, adjusting spectacles, leaning over one another's shoulders to point out lines of notes memorized by lamplight. Naomi found her seat at the back of the lecture hall, the polished wood cool beneath her palms as she laid out her pencil and her notebook, her eyes lifting to watch the professor stride to the front, the heavy anatomy book under his arm, the scent of chalk sharp in the air as he wrote on the board. She listened, drinking in each word, each term, the language of the body that she had studied in secret now alive around her, the murmured repetitions of her classmates weaving with the professor's explanations, forming a rhythm that settled into her bones. She saw diagrams of the heart's chambers, of the fine lacework of veins beneath skin, of the lungs that opened like flowers with each breath, and she felt the ache in her hands from years of scrubbing floors, from carrying water, from turning the pages of Martha's worn books. But she kept writing, her pencil moving quickly, her notes precise and clear, her eyes steady as they traced each detail. The days began to blend into a pattern that was both comforting and relentless. At dawn, she would rise, washing her face in the cold water of her small room, pulling on her coat, slipping her books into the worn leather bag that had been Martha's, stepping into the street as the city stretched itself awake. Her mornings were spent in lectures, afternoons in the small clinic where she volunteered, assisting in the examination rooms, learning how to measure pulses, how to record symptoms, how to clean and bandage wounds. She moved quietly through the halls, her eyes sharp, her hands steady, the nurses beginning to nod to her in greeting, the doctors learning to trust the quickness of her observations, the certainty with which she fetched instruments and prepared tables. At night, she returned to her room, the gas lamp hissing softly as she studied, the soft scratch of her pencil the only sound as the city outside settled into the dark, the glow of street lamps and the distant cry of a train weaving into the silence. She missed Martha in those hours, missed the warmth of her presence, the low hum of her voice, the gentle way her hand would rest on Naomi's head as she read aloud. But she would close her eyes, pressing her hand to her heart, reminding herself of the promise she had made, of the reason she was here, of the path she was carving with each day she refused to give in. Word of Naomi began to spread in quiet ways, her name spoken in the hallways by other students who wondered how the quiet girl in the back always knew the answers, how her hands were so sure during practical lessons, how she stayed late to practice sutures on cloth while others hurried home. Some looked at her with respect, others with curiosity, and a few with the sharp, wary gaze of those who saw her as a challenge to their easy confidence. But Naomi kept her head down, her focus fixed on the learning, on the work, on the goal that burned like a small, steady flame in the center of her chest. Then, on a cold morning near the end of autumn, the hospital called for volunteers to assist with a severe case arriving by carriage, a young man injured in an accident, the details unclear but the urgency unmistakable. Naomi followed the nurse through the back halls, her apron tied tight, her hands washed raw, her heart pounding with the sharp focus that always came in moments of need. The doors swung open, the cold air rushing in as two men carried the stretcher, the young man's face pale and drawn, his breaths ragged, blood staining the front of his expensive coat. Naomi stepped forward, her hands moving automatically, checking his pulse, noting the irregular beat, the weakness, the heat of fever against his cool skin. She lifted her eyes to his face, and in that instant the world seemed to tilt, the edges of the room sharpening into painful clarity as she recognized the line of his jaw, the curl of his hair, the way his eyes fluttered open, blue and lost, the same shade she had seen in the mirror of another life. John Whitmore. She had seen him in newspapers over the years, the heir to the Whitmore estate, photographed at charity events, standing beside his parents in perfectly tailored suits, the son of the man and woman who had discarded her, who had denied her existence, who had built their lives on the lie that she did not belong to them. She had seen his face in her dreams, in her nightmares, the boy who had been the symbol of everything she had lost, everything she had fought to overcome. Now he lay before her, broken, in need, and the world held its breath as Naomi's hands hovered over him, the nurse glancing at her with impatience, urging her to help. Naomi took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, her hands settling on his wrist, feeling the weak flutter of his pulse, steadying herself as she turned to the nurse, her voice calm as she asked for clean cloths, for hot water, for the instruments they would need. She worked with a quiet, focused precision, cleaning the wound, preparing the instruments, holding the young man steady as the doctor arrived, his movements quick and sure as he assessed the injury, issuing orders that Naomi followed without hesitation. She felt John's eyes on her as he drifted in and out of consciousness, confusion and pain mingling with something else, something unspoken, a question that hung in the air between them as the room filled with the scent of blood and disinfectant, as the work continued, as life and death hovered close. When the procedure was over, when the bleeding had stopped and the young man lay still, his breath coming in easier gasps, Naomi stepped back, her apron stained, her hands trembling as she pulled off the gloves, dropping them into the waste bin before stepping out into the hall. She leaned against the cool wall, closing her eyes, letting the trembling pass, letting the memory of his face settle into her mind, a reminder of the past that had never truly left her, of the blood that tied them together, whether they would acknowledge it or not. In the days that followed, Naomi continued her work, tending to other patients, studying late into the night, practicing her sutures, memorizing her textbooks, but always, in the back of her mind, she saw his face, heard his labored breathing, felt the weight of the truth pressing against her like a storm waiting to break. She told herself it did not matter, that she was here for herself, for Martha, for the promise she had made, that the past had no power over her anymore. But one afternoon, as she walked through the ward, checking the charts at the end of each bed, she felt his gaze on her, turning to find John Whitmore sitting up, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of confusion and recognition, his face pale but healing, the bandages clean against his skin. He called out to her, his voice rough, asking for her name, asking why she seemed familiar, asking who she was. Naomi felt the world tighten around her, the air growing thin as she looked at him, seeing the boy who had once thrown stones, who had once laughed as she picked up her books from the dirt, who had once represented everything she was not allowed to be. She took a breath, steadying herself, and gave him her name. Naomi. Nothing more. Turning back to her work, refusing to let the past take hold, refusing to let the questions in his eyes drag her back into the darkness she had fought to leave behind. But the questions remained, unspoken but heavy, the weight of the past pressing closer with each passing day, as John's eyes followed her through the ward, as whispers began to rise among the staff about the resemblance, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, about the secrets that lay buried beneath the clean white sheets of the hospital beds. Naomi lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the soft hiss of the gas lamp the only sound in the small room, wondering how long she could keep the past at bay, how long she could continue to walk the line she had carved for herself without the truth shattering the fragile peace she had built. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling the steady beat, the reminder that she was alive, that she had survived, that she was more than the whispers, more than the blood that tied her to a family that had denied her. And in that quiet, in the darkness before dawn, Naomi promised herself once more that she would not be broken, that she would continue, that she would finish what she had begun, no matter what the past tried to take from her. The city of Aurelia moved steadily beneath a sky that shifted between dawn grays and copper evenings, the chimneys breathing thin columns of smoke into the chilled air while the streets pulsed with the lives of people chasing bread, work, love, and the promise of another tomorrow. Naomi moved among them now, not as a shadow, but as a presence, rising each morning with the certainty of purpose she had forged in silence, in hunger, in the long nights reading by candlelight, while Martha's voice hummed in memory, reminding her of who she was and why she could not let herself be small. Each morning she pulled on her crisp white coat, the collar pressed flat, the buttons polished, the weight of it both a promise and a burden, as she stepped through the doors of the hospital where her life had become measured in steps between patient beds, in the quiet steadiness of her hands as she checked pulses, examined wounds, reassured frightened eyes with the calm certainty that had taken years to cultivate. There were days when exhaustion pressed at the edges of her mind, when the constant murmur of grief in the halls felt like a tide against which she could only brace herself. But Naomi had learned to breathe through those moments, to feel her feet on the floor, to let the memory of the cold forest night when she had been left alone remind her that this was not suffering. This was a life reclaimed. John Whitmore was recovering, and his presence in the hospital began to draw the kind of attention that men of his family name naturally attracted, though there was a different softness to him now that sickness had stripped away the careless cruelty he had once worn like a badge. He watched Naomi from his bed as she moved from patient to patient, the realization of who she was forming slowly in his eyes like a dawn he did not know how to greet. His questions grew over days, small attempts at conversation when she came to check his bandages, when she brought water, when she noted his pulse, the words hovering on his tongue before falling silent in the air between them. Naomi answered only what was necessary, her voice calm, professional, her gaze meeting his with a quiet steel that allowed no room for pity, for sentiment, for the tangled knots of blood and abandonment that lay hidden beneath the sterile white of the hospital walls. But the truth had a way of pressing forward, and there were days when John's eyes would flick to her face and remain there, studying the lines of her jaw, the curve of her cheek, the dark intensity of her eyes, the way her hair glinted under the lamplight when she leaned over to adjust a bandage. He began to speak of memories he could not place, of a girl in a village, of whispers he had overheard outside closed doors when he was a boy, of the cold look in his father's eyes and the tightness in his mother's voice when certain subjects were raised. Naomi would feel the tension in her spine as he spoke, but she said nothing, her hands steady, her eyes cool, her mind focusing on the work before her because there was no room for the past here, no space for the ache that threatened to unmoor her. Outside the hospital, the world moved with a restless energy, the city's pulse aligning with Naomi's own as she attended her studies at the college, as she prepared for the examinations that would determine whether she could continue the path she had carved from the ashes of a life once deemed disposable. She spent her nights over anatomy texts and medical journals, her days in the wards, the rhythm of learning and applying binding together into a cadence that drove her forward. There were moments of doubt, of fear, the weight of the expectations she placed upon herself pressing down with the memory of Martha's face in the low glow of a candle, whispering that she was strong enough, that she had come too far to stop now. News of Naomi's skill began to spread beyond the quiet circles of her instructors and fellow students, reaching into the broader community of Aurelia's medical world, whispered in the hallways of the college and the hospital, noted in the precise way she handled emergencies, in the calm certainty with which she faced the cases others shied away from. And in the quiet before dawn, when she walked to the hospital in the cool dark, with the fog rolling low over the streets, Naomi felt the stirrings of something she could not name, a sense that perhaps she was no longer invisible, that the light she had fought to keep alive inside her was now seen, now recognized, now undeniable. The moment of truth came on a morning drenched in rain, the streets slick with water that mirrored the gray sky as Naomi arrived at the hospital to find the entrance crowded with journalists, their notebooks ready, their eyes bright with the hunger for a story that would fill the columns of tomorrow's papers. She moved past them with the certainty of someone who had learned to command her own space, stepping into the warmth of the hospital where the day's work awaited, where lives needed saving, where there was no time for the drama waiting beyond the doors, but the world outside refused to wait. The Whitmore family arrived, their presence filling the corridors with an uncomfortable silence, the weight of their name pressing down on the staff who moved aside, who lowered their voices, who glanced at Naomi as she stood near the nurse's station, her hands folded around her charts, her eyes watching as a woman with pale hair and blue eyes approached. Rebecca Whitmore had aged in the way that only those who carry deep secrets do, her beauty sharpened into a brittle elegance, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Naomi, widening with the shock of recognition, the color draining from her face as the past rose between them, undeniable, unchangeable, real. There was a moment of stillness, the world holding its breath as mother and daughter looked at one another, the truth that had been denied for so long settling into the space between them like a living thing. Naomi stood her ground, her shoulders square, her chin lifted, refusing to be the child who had once been cast aside, refusing to allow the shame and fear in Rebecca's eyes to diminish the woman she had become. John stepped forward then, his voice quiet, trembling as he looked between his mother and Naomi, the realization settling in, the pieces falling into place, the unspoken questions finding their answers in the lines of Naomi's face, in the shape of her hands, in the truth that blood will always recognize itself, no matter how deeply it is denied. It became news, of course. The daughter abandoned by the Whitmore family had returned, not as a beggar, not as a shadow, but as a doctor, as a woman whose name was now spoken with respect, whose hands saved lives, whose determination had carried her from the steps of a village church to the halls of Aurelia's most respected hospital. The journalists who had waited in the rain found their story, the headline that would sell papers, the image that would capture the city's imagination. Naomi did not run from the attention. She stood in front of the cameras when they came, her white coat clean, her hair pulled back, her eyes clear and calm as she answered questions about her work, about her journey, about the belief that a person is not defined by where they come from, but by what they choose to do with their pain, with their dreams, with their strength. She spoke of Martha, of the small house filled with herbs and stories, of the promise she had made to a woman who loved her when no one else would, of the promise she had kept, the promise she would continue to keep. The city listened. The world listened. And for the first time, Naomi felt seen, felt heard, felt that the voice she had protected, the light she had carried through every dark day, was now something that could not be silenced. The recognition led to an invitation to speak at the National Conference for Young Medical Professionals, a moment Naomi accepted with the quiet dignity that had become her armor, her grace, her inheritance. On the day of the event, she stood backstage, breathing deeply, the weight of the moment pressing lightly on her shoulders, a reminder of how far she had come, of how close she had once been to giving up, of how easy it would have been to let the world win. When her name was called, Naomi stepped forward, the applause rising around her as she approached the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on John, sitting with his mother, their faces pale, their eyes bright with the complicated tangle of regret and pride, of fear and awe, of a past that could not be undone but could no longer dictate who Naomi was. She began to speak, her voice steady, clear, ringing through the hall as she told her story, not as a plea for pity, but as a testament to the power of resilience, of determination, of choosing to rise when the world tries to push you down. She spoke of the child who had once been left in the cold, of the woman who had found her and loved her, of the long nights spent studying by candlelight, of the first time she held a patient's hand and promised to fight for their life, of the journey that had led her to this stage, to this moment. And as she spoke, Naomi felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders, the ghosts of the village and the whispers of the neighbors fading into the light of the present, into the warmth of the applause that rose around her, into the knowledge that she had kept her promise, that she had become the woman she was meant to be, that her voice, strong and unwavering, would echo beyond this day, carrying forward into every life she would touch, into every patient she would heal, into every young girl who would see her and know that it was possible to rise. When she stepped down from the stage, the applause still ringing in her ears, Naomi lifted her head, meeting the eyes of the city that had once been a stranger to her, seeing in their faces the reflection of her own strength, her own light, her own unbreakable spirit. And she smiled, not because the journey was over, but because it was hers, and no one could ever take that from her again. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more true stories that inspire and challenge. Check out our other videos to continue exploring stories that matter. And if this touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching.